The Benin bronzes stunned Europeans who saw them.
People worried long and hard about the Benin bronzes. Could they really have been made by Africans? Were they actually made by Portuguese for them? We now know, of course, that they were made by Africans, and that casting tradition stretches back long, long before European influence. But at the time, they changed, very importantly, our preconceptions about what African art was and what Africans were like.
But the people who made these majestic sculptures, dating from the 16th to the 19th century, were relative newcomers in the art and craft of casting metal.
They were newcomers in art and craft of sculpture. They are newcomers. As in, I wanted only be taught to look, but I want to shape for count on my shape. But I want you to discover me.
Their oral traditions told them that they had learned their skills from the Yoruba people of Ife, about 100 miles away to the northwest.
From the Yoruba people in Ife, not to look back.
In fact, this Benin bronze of a man on horseback has been interpreted as a metalsmith from Ife, bringing the knowledge of casting techniques to the people of Benin. Benin bronze of a man on... In fact, this Benin bronze of a man on horseback has been interpreted as a metalsmith from Ife, bringing the knowledge of casting techniques to the people of Benin. In modern times, the first awareness in the world outside Nigeria of a unique and distinctive art of Ife came in the early years of the 20th century. A German anthropologist, Leo Frobenius, led an expedition to West Africa and visited Ife. For a few weeks in 1910, Frobenius carried out excavations and unearthed many terracotta and stone heads. But he was also shown a brass head, which he was told was Olokun, the Yoruba god of the sea. He photographed it for his book, The Voice of Africa. It bears a striking resemblance to the head of Ife in the British Museum.
Closer to me is the cast of the head, which Leo Frobenius was shown in 1910, which is called the Olokun head. And the second is the original head, which is in the British Museum. As you can see, both heads are done according to the same aesthetic traditions. The treatment of the face, the nose, the lips are made in the same way. The treatment of the ethnic marks are the same also on the face. They indicate the same tradition of producing brass heads.
The sight of the brass Olokun head threw Leo Frobenius into a state of utter confusion.
Only the sight of Olokun head equal all through Fabinho all through into confusion. He was confused.
Olokun head threw Leo Frobenius into a state of utter confusion. He simply couldn't believe that the people of Ife had ever been capable of making such a sophisticated object.
In 1910, it was generally thought that African sculpture was extremely unrealistic, savage heads, the sort of thing that Picasso was inspired by. That was thought to be the way Africans carved. And to find in Ife a head which rivaled in accomplishment the finest naturalism of the Greek Elgin marbles or whatever, was a huge surprise. And people thought, well, that's not how Africans carved. Africans don't make naturalistic sculpture. Naturalism is the high point of civilization, and they refuse to believe that Africans themselves did this.
The high point of what, sir?
The highest point of civilization.
Greek Elgin marbles, or in the way sort of think was in 1910
making such a sophisticated object.
In 1910, it was generally thought that African sculpture was extremely unrealistic, savage heads, the sort of thing that Picasso was inspired by. That was thought to be the way Africans carved. And to find in Ife a head which rivaled in accomplishment the finest naturalism of the Greek.
All rival the finest. She understand the sculptures of the Greek. All rival there. She understand. So one believe we hey in Africa and can create your own combine.
Rivaled in accomplishment the finest naturalism of the Greek Elgin marbles or whatever was a huge surprise, and people thought, well, that's not how Africans carved. Africans don't make naturalistic sculpture. Naturalism is the high point of civilization, and they refuse to believe that Africans themselves did this.
Naturalism is the highest point of civilization, so they don't believe African actually carved this.
Frobenius came up with a novel suggestion to explain the existence of the sculptures he discovered in Ife.
Frobenius said, well, it must be that this was a Greek civilization, and even went so far as to say that it was proof that Atlantis existed, and this was the remains of a Greek colony of however many centuries earlier than that.
Thinking that in Ife he had stumbled upon the remains of Atlantis shed little light on the Yoruba tradition of metal casting. Today, Ife is a sprawling city of 500,000 people. There were more treasures to come from beneath the soil of this ancient place. In January 1938, a man started digging the foundations for a new house in this compound, not far from the royal palace of the king, or Oni of Ife. As the work progressed on this site, a total of 18 sculptures were unearthed. Many were lying just a few feet below the surface, and one of them was the head now in the British Museum.
We can really say that the Ife metal heads were discovered twice. They were discovered for the first time by Frobenius in 1910. And that was somehow forgotten. And then they were rediscovered again in the late 1930s and once more caused a sensation.
This sensational and unexpected new find was reported with great enthusiasm by an American anthropologist, William Bascom, in Illustrated London News. Such was the high quality of the work that he likened the unknown people who made them to the great Italian Renaissance sculptor, Donatello.
Kò tún reference pé àwọn Yorùbá ló ṣe ń get wọn ti gbà ẹgbọ́n àwọn tó ní kán ṣe àwọn Italian lẹ́kọ̀ọ́ lọ́nà kan fẹ́ ṣe.
Such was the high quality of the work that he likened the unknown people who made them to the great
the unknown people who made them to what?
Italian Renaissance sculptor Donatello. He wrote, "Little that Italy, Greece, or Egypt ever produced could be finer, and the appeal of their beauty is immediate and universal." Most of the heads unearthed in 1938 remained with the Oni of Ife. These are casts of some of them held in the British Museum collection. The sight of such a large group of refined naturalistic work had a profound effect on Europeans, but the idea still persisted that they couldn't be the work of Africans.
Idea Oshi persists because they still don't believe it is the work of Africans. wọn ì tí ì gbà pé àwọn bàbá wa wọ́n ní ọgbọ́n, wọ́n ní òmọ̀, wọ́n ní òye láti lè fi gbẹ́ irú nǹkan báyìí because ẹ mọ̀ àbí over 800 years kan náà sọ láti ń gbẹ́ láti làwọn bàbá wa ti gbẹ́ àwọn ère yìí gbà tán ṣe carbon date kìíní ẹ̀ over 800 years ipe kò possible sẹ́ 800 years ago kò sẹ́ni tó ní ọpọlọ tó lè gbẹ́ nǹkan báyìí kò ń ṣe pẹ̀lú òkúta kò ń ṣe pẹ̀lú igi pẹ̀lú brass ẹ mọ̀ nǹkan tó ń pè ní brass because ẹ ní láti melt ẹ̀ you need to melt it lẹ́yìn tẹ́ bá melt ẹ̀ ẹ ṣẹ̀ṣẹ̀ wá shape ẹ̀ and look at it almost the life size of a human head ẹ mọ̀ because wọ́n máa ṣe o Yorùbá ọlọ́mọ ayẹ ká ya ọmọ àlè kalẹ̀ àwa ń sọ̀rọ̀ ṣàkàṣàkà sáwọn ancestor tiwa à ń sọ̀rọ̀ pé wọn ọ̀gbọ́n wọn à civilize wọn lọ́pọlọ òyìnbó ló fún wa láṣọ
everybody is talking against our ancestors.
òyìnbó ló kọ́ wa.
kò sẹ́ni bẹ́ẹ̀ tó sọ pé wọ́n gbọ́n.
pure dev ẹjọ nǹkan tá à ń listen sí yìí it transcends all the nonsense tá à ń discuss tẹ́lẹ̀ ẹ jẹ́ káwọn èèyàn gbọ́ please. Let's listen.
Hold on, sir. Just to add to your card, Sishari, Orioloko ton show, ton koko show ní bẹ̀rẹ̀ yẹn. Ìgbà tí tẹ́ bá lọ sí Yemo Grove ní Nífẹ̀, ẹ máa rí pé gbogbo bẹ̀ yẹn, ẹ máa rí pé ancient pavement wà ń bẹ̀ all over the road there. Then there is also water system. Jẹ́ pé wọ́n fi ancient pipe tó fi run gbogbo area yẹn. So and then there are some area different nígbà kan gbọ́dọ̀gbọ́dọ̀ wà ń dàgbà. There is a lot of ìgbà yẹn àti àmọ̀ pé nǹkan tó jẹ́ nìyẹn. But ẹ máa rí pé there is a lot of some pavement tó pé wọ́n fi àpáàdì ṣe and there are some tó yẹ pé wọ́n lo òkúta tó pé wọ́n lo òkúta so oge tí mo ń sọ yìí anybody lè sọ ní Google kó béèrè pé was there any water system initiative ó wà ń bẹ̀ kò ìsàn tó fi ní kíní and there is still a lot of archaeological diggings still going to date but sherry problem ta ní pé there is no funding because round kan bí eléyìí kò ju àwọn èèyàn wa lójú.
Gbogbo ẹ̀dínmọ̀ ni ọ̀sán
nígbà tí o ti ṣe pé inú bíbélì ni wọ́n kọ sí báwo ló ṣe máa jẹ wọ́n lójú.
wọ́n fẹ́ lọ ibi tán
and it is not European owned.
Ibi tán sí Jésù sí.
kò lè jẹ wọ́n lójú náà.
Galilee ibi tán bí Jésù ní Bethlehem yẹn la fẹ́ lọ wò.
báwo ni ibo náà ti fẹ́ rí ṣé wọ́n rí ni ṣé wọ́n mọ ibi tó wà ní.
a fẹ́ lọ kíìsì Kàbá ká lọ gun òkè kí náà wọ́n ń gòkè Àràfá.
William Bascom wrote, "How in a comparatively obscure corner of this vast and backward continent could an art and a technique have flowered that take their stand beside the best ever evolved by the elaborate civilizations of Europe and Asia?"
Sherry, ó sì tún Europe and Asia náà sì tún rẹ́fẹ́ wọn tí gbà pé Africa ló ṣe sẹ́ẹ̀pẹ́ àá.
You know, old stereotypes die hard.
Ṣẹ́gbọ́, old stereotype die hard. Nǹkan yẹn ló ṣì ń ṣẹlẹ̀ lẹ́ni, wọ́n ṣì ń stereotype wà títí díẹ̀ ní not pé nǹkan tá a dẹ̀ ń sọ fún àwọn èèyàn wá tún wá ń gbè sẹ́yìn àwọn tó ń stereotype wà. Ẹ sì tún ń support wọn, ẹ sì tún ń defend wọn. Come on. Títí dé ni òyìnbó ṣì ń stereotype wà dọ̀la pé àgbọn a lè ṣe nǹkan kan àwa náà dẹ̀ ń gbà pé àgbọn a lè ṣe nǹkan kan and we still believe that. Ta ló fẹ́ gbà wá báyìí how can we save ourselves? Ta ló fẹ́ gbà wá táwa gan tá a bá lè gbà ara wa ta ló fẹ́ defend tá a bá lè defend ara wa. Ẹ gbọ́ old stereotype die hard because
civilizations of Europe and Asia.
You know, old stereotypes die hard, and in spite of the discoveries of Frobenius in 1910, and in spite of the Benin brass castings from 1897, people still had this view of African art as schematic wood sculpture, rather jagged and angular and sort of unlifelike and all the rest of it. So, placed in the context of African art, this head had the effect of forcing Europeans to expand their view of what could be considered art in Africa.
It wasn't just that Europeans couldn't believe that Africans had the artistic sensibility to create such an object as the head of Ife. They couldn't believe either that Africans had the technological know-how to cast it.
They couldn't believe Africans have the technology know-how to carve it. Won't believe it.
Couldn't believe either that Africans had the technological know-how to cast it. The head of Ife was made using the lost wax process, now known to have been practiced in West Africa for centuries before the first Europeans set foot there.
The artist would have started with a clay core, probably with some animal dung, perhaps some cereal husk in there as well. Once the clay core was modelled into a roughly human head shape, sheets of beeswax would have been modelled onto that of a known thickness. And a lot of the Ife heads are cast incredibly finely, so the thinness of the wax, which was probably also a relatively valuable material, would have been important. And this would have been modelled to give all the detail that the final metal casting should have. Having done that, he would enclose the whole wax and structure with this same clay dung sand mixture, very carefully pushed into all the detail that was in the head. And it's how well he pushes the mixture into the wax, how well the bronze will actually cast.
The clay surround with the head inside would then have been heated and the wax melted out. In the traditional lost wax process, molten metal is then...
In the traditional lost wax process, so nǹkan táwọn ìwé tó ń sọ lẹ́ẹ̀kan yẹn ni pé because wọ́n try láti fẹ́ wò pé báwo náà ṣe create kìíní yẹn, but just like bí bàbá àkàrà ògùn ṣe sọ lẹ́ẹ̀kan yẹn wípé a ti lose the knowledge yẹn, we've lost the knowledge. So àwọn èèyàn kàn try láti tún fẹ́ máa ṣe wò bóyá wọ́n lè rí ṣe again, but unfortunately we've lost the knowledge.
Knowledge the space that's been left. But the head of Ife has a secret.
Remember? It only secrets or mercy or
It was probably cast using... But the head of Ife has a secret. It was probably cast using a variation of this technique.
The open pouring of metal tends to be a much later development in Africa. The early West African tradition seems to all have been the enclosed crucible. So what the Ife artist would have done is he would have attached these casting channels, rods of wax, and they would have come to a cup at the top. But in West Africa, they actually put the chips of metal into this space here. They then put an old shard of pottery over the top to protect it and enclose the whole mold like that, so that the metal was already enclosed in the mold. The mold could then be put in a fire, the wax melted out of it, and with a little drain hole that's there, drains all the wax out, that gets plugged, and then the fire's built up in temperature until all these little chips of metal here melt and they flow down into the space where the wax was and fill it up, and hey presto, you've got your bronze.
The general quality of the casting is quite excellent. The metal clearly flowed through all the parts of the mould, including the intricacies of the details on the headdress or crown, and more especially where you look at this, it really is just a one-piece, one-off casting with very little in the way of necessary repairs afterwards where the metal didn't flow or the mould collapsed or something like that, which honestly is a very common fault. If you have a look at your average Greek or Roman equivalent bronze head.
Yeah, it might be no. Only part 2, so part 2.
Then you'll find repairs and all over them.
In the 1980s, the head of Ife was analysed by metal scientists at the British Museum.
Terry, our metal scientists not want to analyze it. Hello. Also long way our metal scientists want to analyze it. Got not teach more than 800 years ago because mystery could see you.
2 small samples were drilled from the head, one from the neck and the other from the crown. The results of the analysis not only determined the composition of the alloy used, but also gave an indication of how the head was actually cast.
When we took samples from the head, we were hoping to be able to try and find out more about the casting conditions. This particular alloy is copper and zinc and lead, but if the metal is molten, then of course the dense droplets of lead have time to sink through the molten brass and concentrate at the bottom. And what we found was there is about 11.8% of lead in the neck of the sample and about 10.8 in the top of the head. Now, this may not seem very much, but it is significant. It does show that the head was cast upright, and secondly, it does suggest that the metal was molten in the mould for, I would guess, 2 or 3 minutes to give the time for that amount of segregation to take place, which once again is a sign of a pretty proficient casting. The guy who cast that knew what he was doing.
Our metal scientists not one by analyzing what our ancestors in.
Analysis of the head also showed that the brass from which it was fashioned was probably imported from thousands of miles away across the Sahara Desert.
Many years ago, the remains of a caravan was found that clearly